Hello everybody, and welcome back to the channel for some more past quality content. Yes, that's going to be something I'm going to say in every single video from now on. But to get into the topic of the video, in the last few months there has been a lot of speculation about what the next Spider-Man movie in the MCU is going to look like. It's been confirmed that Jamie Foxx's Electro from Amazing Spider-Man 2 will be returning, and it's also been confirmed that Doctor Strange will appear in the next Spider-Man movie, Spider-Man 3. And these two confirmations have led most of the internet to the conclusion that there's going to be a Spider-verse in the next movie. And people are even going as far as to say that Tobey Macguire and Andrew Garfield are going to return, reprising their roles as Spider-Men in the Spider-verse, which I think is really cool. I am totally on board with that idea, because I grew up with the Tobey Maguire Spider-Man, and a little bit with the Andrew Garfield Spider-Man. I'm not the biggest fan of his portrayal of Spider-Man, but I still think it's a very good portrayal, and that would be really cool to see him in the MCU with Tom Holland. And yeah, so I'm totally on board with it. So today, I'm going to tell you 5 things that I would want to see in an MCU Spider-verse. Let's go. So before I get into the list, I just want to say that some of the things on this list are going to be specific to a Spider-Verse and the next Spider-Man movie that's going to be coming out next year, and some of them are just going to be any Spider-Verse in the MCU, like if it's in the future or it's more recent. If there's a Spider-Verse in the MCU, I would want to see that. So it's going to vary on whether it would need to be in the next Spider-Man movie or just any time in the future. But with that said, let's get into the list. First up is that I would want to see the MCU's Peter Parker as Spider-Man become more independent. One of the biggest complaints of the MCU Spider-Man, of Tom Holland's portrayal of Spider-Man, is that he's not independent at all. Many people describe him as Iron Man Jr. because so far in the MCU, Spider-Man has been very dependent on Iron Man. I mean, that's where he's gotten all of his suits from so far, is Stark technology. And I think that even if there isn't a Spider-Verse in the next Spider-Man movie, I think that, no matter what, should be the focus of it, is getting him to just be more independent, getting him to be the Spider-Man we know and love, the independent Spider-Man, rather than, again, Iron Man Jr. And I think that that would make it cool, because it would make that the arc of his trilogy, is getting from, Homecoming is trying to be an Avenger, trying to, prove himself to Iron Man, and Far From Home is like he wants to get as far away from being an Avenger as possible. And I think in the third one, it should be him really finding where he falls in the mix of, he's not full Avenger, but he's also not, totally away from the Avengers. Like, he's Spider-Man. Like, he's not gonna be dependent on all of the Avengers, but he's also not gonna be completely independent. So, I think that should be his arc in the trilogy. And I think that a Spider-Verse would be pretty much the perfect way to bring him to that stage. Because I think seeing all of these other Spider-Men who are independent of the Avengers would, I think, help him to become more independent, to become Spider-Man, the Spider-Man we know and love, like the Tobey Maguire Spider-Man or the Andrew Garfield Spider-Man. That would help him to grow into the independence. So I think if there's going to be a Spider-Verse in the next Spider-Man movie, it should be used as a way to create more independence in the MCU Spider-Man. Next up is, I think Doctor Strange should be in it as little as possible. This kind of goes with the last point of making Spider-Man more independent, because if you throw Doctor Strange in the mix to be a really big character in the movie, it kind of takes away from his independence a bit, because I feel like you could run into dangerous territory where you end up making Doctor Strange the new Iron Man, the new mentor of Peter Parker, and that's not what we want. We want the independent Peter Parker, because he should really just be the means to which the other Spider-Men come into the MCU's universe, and maybe even just the way that they go back to their universes, but he really shouldn't play too much of a role in this movie besides just being the means to which the Spider-Verse is created. So I think Doctor Strange should really not play a big role in this movie. Then, at number 3, I want to see the MCU Spider-Man finally bring up Uncle Ben. So far in the MCU, Peter has never brought up Uncle Ben. He's sort of vaguely alluded to it in Homecoming.
May cannot know. I cannot do that to her right now. You know? I mean, everything that's happened with her, Please.
But besides that, he's really not said anything about it. And even in Homecoming, it's not even completely clear if that's what he's talking about. I mean, you can assume that's what it is, but it's not at all, clear that that's the thing he's talking about. And I think that a Spider-Verse would be the perfect way to introduce the idea of Uncle Ben. Because seeing, Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man and Andrew Garfield's Spider-Man, 2 Spider-Men that we've seen lose their Uncle Ben, I think that would be a good way of sort of, getting the MCU Spider-Man to bring it up in a way that doesn't really feel forced. You could have something almost like the scene from Into the Spider-Verse where they're in the dorm room and they're all talking about, who they lost after Miles loses Uncle Aaron. And you can sort of have that same kind of moment between Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man, Andrew Garfield's Spider-Man, and Tom Holland's Spider-Man, where they all talk about their Uncle Bens and how they lost them. And I think that would be a really good way of bringing it up without, just kind of shoehorning it in there. So, in a Spider-Verse, I definitely would want to see Tom Holland's Spider-Man finally mention Uncle Ben. Then, the 4th thing I would want to see is an aged-up Peter Parker in the form of Tobey Maguire. So, we've seen multiple times that the MCU is amazing at de-aging people. They've de-aged Michael Douglas, Lawrence Fishburne, Kurt Russell, and even Samuel L. Jackson for a whole entire movie. So we know that it would be pretty easy for them to de-age Tobey Maguire just 10 years or whatever to make him, closer to how he looked in the original Sam Raimi trilogy. But I don't think they should do that. Because I think they should almost age him up a little bit more, because I think having an older Peter Parker like they had in Into the Spider-Verse would be really cool for, the MCU to do and for the MCU Spider-Man to interact with, instead of having, Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man just a few years after Spider-Man 3. I think you should have him coming into this universe married to MJ with maybe a few kids, and maybe he had retired from being Spider-Man. I don't know, but just, I think it would be really cool to have, to see where Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man ends up, let's say, 10 or 20 years later. And I think that would be really cool for, people like me who grew up watching the Sam Raimi trilogy to not just see him come straight out of Spider-Man 3 into this movie, to see, again, where he ends up. I think that would be a really cool concept. And lastly, I think that the Spider-Verse should happen at the end of the movie. So this is more for if the Spider-Verse happens in the next Spider-Man movie, because I think that having it be at the end, obviously you don't have to get Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield to sign on for an entire movie, so that would be easier to get them back just being, 1 or 2 scenes hey, I'm here, Spider-Man. But I also think that it could be a really cool moment, sort of like the portal scene in Endgame, where the MCU Spider-Man is down. He's trying to get back up, but he can't. And then a portal behind him opens, and Tobey Maguire walks out and says, "Pizza time," or something. Obviously something less cheesy than that. Get it? Wow. And then another portal opens up, and Andrew Garfield walks out. Then there's a bunch of portals opening up. And you have Miles Morales and Spider-Gwen and a bunch of Spider-Men from all different universes coming out. Spider-Man Noir, Spider-Man 2099, and I think that would be the best way to do it than have it be the whole thing. Or at least just have, like, Tobey Macguire, Andrew Garfield, like, be for most of the movie, and then have the ending be every single Spider-Man from every universe come into it. I think that would be really epic. And then, of course, the portals thing would somehow be connected to the plot, like maybe through, Doctor Strange, or maybe the villain is doing a thing with portals, and that's how Electro shows up earlier in the movie. I don't know. But I think that if you're going to do the big Spider-Verse with all the different Spider-Man, it should be at the end of the movie during the final battle. And then, of course, if it's not happening in the next movie, then just do it for the entire movie in the next one, because that would be really cool. Or do it in, like, Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness or something. But I want Spider-Verse at some point in the MCU, and I think introducing it at the end of the next Spider-Man movie would be a good way to do it. Anyway, though, that is 5 things that I would want to see in an MCU Spider-Verse. Please comment below, what would you want to see in an MCU Spider-Verse? And also, do you think it's actually going to happen? Like, 1, do you think it's ever going to happen? And 2, is it going to be in the next Spider-Man movie? Comment below your thoughts. And also, remember to like, subscribe, check out some of my other videos. And with that said, that's a wrap.